Good evening. This is Bill Baxter and Short Story Time Theater. Tonight's story is from my book Web Tales, once again, and it is entitled Double Jeopardy. Rebecca Town Nurse was born on February 21st, 1621, in England, and eventually came to the American colonies. She later married Francis Nurse and settled near Salem, Massachusetts, around 1647. Francis and Rebecca Nurse had several children. Francis Nurse was a very prosperous farmer, along with his neighbors, John Proctor and Giles Corey. Rebecca Nurse was one of the most devoted servants of God and the church in the Salem community. Francis and Rebecca Nurse grew old together, living near Salem. In their later years, the Nurses, Coreys, and Proctors often were embroiled in bitter land disputes with hard-nosed landowners led by Thomas and Edward Putnam. Then a dark cloud passed over Salem in the year 1692. Thomas Putnam's child supposedly took ill. The child displayed fits and very strange behavior. The child's diagnosis was something very unique: the illness stemmed from witchcraft present in the community. This sent the town of Salem into frenzy and into one of the darkest times in colonial history. Other kids in Salem started making mischief by behaving very strangely as well. The so-called afflicted children began pointing fingers at adults throughout Salem and even made claims that the adult spirits had paid them nocturnal visits while they were asleep in their beds. The phony evidence displayed by the mischievous children resulted in over 100 arrests throughout the Massachusetts colony. They were all charged with practicing witchcraft. Soon the Salem witchcraft trials began, which resulted in several false convictions and hangings. Chief Justice William Stoughton presided over these trials. It is no coincidence that the Putnam child and the other afflicted children pointed their fingers at the Proctors, the Coreys, and eventually Rebecca Nurse herself, the very people the Putnams were having land disputes with. The authenticity of the 1692 witchcraft trials was severely questioned when Rebecca Nurse was arrested for practicing witchcraft and brought to trial. Many people throughout the colony knew what a devoted servant of the church Rebecca Nurse was. A petition was signed by several people on Rebecca Nurse's behalf. The jury came back with a verdict of not guilty. Someone in the courtroom whispered, "But she's one of us." Immediately, Stoughton ordered the jury to go back and deliberate the case all over again, which pretty much subjected Rebecca Nurse to being tried twice for the same crime. The jury re-entered the courtroom, this time with a verdict of guilty. So Sir William Phips, the governor of the Massachusetts colony, immediately granted Rebecca Nurse a reprieve. But the afflicted children started doing their harlequin hooligan acts again, and the reprieve was overturned. Rebecca Nurse was excommunicated from the church and then boarded onto a wagon, which transported her along with a few others convicted of practicing witchcraft, out to Gallows Hill. As Rebecca Nurse stood on the gallows, she opened her eyes to God in heaven and spoke the Lord's Prayer word for word, telling the whole world that she was innocent and the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692 was a kangaroo court sham. A witch cannot pray the Lord's Prayer. Soon after praying the Lord's Prayer, the trap door opened and Rebecca Nurse swung. By then, she was very old and frail, so it didn't take long. Rebecca Nurse was hung on July 19th, 1692. Her family later retrieved her body and gave her the decent burial that she deserved. And the news of the unjust incident spread. The Salem witchcraft trials soon came to an end, and Governor Phipps pardoned the rest of the people who had been falsely charged with practicing witchcraft. In future years, Rebecca Nurse's family was reinstated in the church, and Rebecca herself received a full pardon. Almost 100 years later, shortly after our forefathers wrote the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution in 1791. Within the Fifth Amendment of the Bill of Rights, the double jeopardy clause was written. This clause specifically says that an individual cannot be tried a second time for the same crime. Once a jury comes back with a verdict of not guilty, the judge will ask the jury, "Is this your verdict?" The foreman of the jury will say yes, and then it's over. There are no more deliberations, no more trials, no more evidence is to be entered, nothing. And that's the way it has been since that clause was written in the Bill of Rights 200 years ago. The clause certainly would have come in handy 300 years ago in Salem, Massachusetts. That's the end of this tonight's story. Please tune in as I will be presenting more stories on Short Story Time Theater with William Baxter. You all have a good evening and a good weekend.